Hello all, welcome back to 5WH. Some of you may have seen in the news that some shenanigans have been going on down in Guatemala following their general election. There's been a winner announced, the winner has had his party suspended, the loser has refused to accept defeat, where have we heard that before, allegations of fraud flying left, right and centre, along with allegations of corruption, legal action, comments from the United States and other countries in the region. And everything's getting pretty chaotic. So, what is actually going on? Well, as far as we can tell, Alevado came second place in the first round of the general election, beating his rival Torres, then in the runoff by over 20 points. This, by Guatemalan standards, amounts to a landslide. However, Torres has not yet conceded and is bandying around numerous allegations of fraud with literally no evidence that that is the case. One could question, where else have we seen that before? So, Alevado's party, known as Seed Movement, has also had 7 members elected to Congress, including Alevado himself. And for framing of this, the UNE Sandra Torres, his rival's party, won 28 seats, making them the second largest party in the 160-seat Congress. So, the basis for the legal actions currently ongoing against Seed Movement stem from allegations of irregularities with the signatures on the party's foundational documents dating back to 2018. No evidence for this has been forthcoming. However, the prosecutor in question has succeeded in obtaining a court order against Seed, and this has resulted in the the presidency of the Congress, like their rules committee, if you will, suspending the party. No one really knows what that means. I don't think it's a constitutionally defined term. If someone from Guatemala is out there, please tell me. So, Seed Movement has made allegations that it has been targeted as a result of it causing political upset by winning the election, and makes pretty consistent allegations that the steps being taken against it are aiming to prevent the lawful transition of power. Supporting Seed Movement's allegations are the fact that the Attorney General seeking to bring actions against them has a reputation for corruption, both internationally, and has been sanctioned for it. The OAS, the Organization of American States, like a regional power, a bit like the African Union or like a low-power EU, has had monitors for the Guatemalan election, and the observers announced the election was free and fair. Additionally, the US has weighed in and is pressing for the lawful and peaceful transition of power to Alevado. In terms of what's ongoing, the Attorney General is still investigating wrongdoing regarding the signatures and the formation. We've yet to see what will happen with that. There have been about 2 weeks now of legal battles about Seed Movement status. At present, the suspension has been stayed, but it's only been stayed for the duration of the election period, which is until the 1st of November. So it's entirely possible that unless this matter is resolved fully by that point, the suspension, whatever that means, will come back in force. As said, we're not entirely sure what that means in real terms. However, it is highly likely that if the suspension comes back into force, that members of Seed will not be able to take up leadership positions in the Congress, thus hamstringing Alevado's potential presidency. To my knowledge, nothing at the moment will prevent either Seed Party members or Alevado himself taking up their position as members of Congress or the president. Big emphasis on the yet there, though. And then just reiterate, Sandra Torres has still not conceded and has declared the election a fraud. So that's what's happened. So let's get a bit of geography. So as normal, nice little Google Maps clip here. So you've got Guatemala roughly midway up the map on the left-hand side. Immediately to its north, or northwest, you can see the southern states of Mexico. And then to its east, you've got Belize, southeast Honduras, and south El Salvador. As you can see, it's got both Atlantic and Pacific coastlines, with the Pacific obviously being the larger one, because Belize takes up most of the sort of Caribbean Atlantic coast. The physical geography is important insofar as the location in the Americas means that Guatemala is a key both trafficking route for drugs and people, and also a key point of origin for a lot of migrants heading particularly up towards the United States. So again, the geographical relevance here, any trouble is likely to cause increase in migrant flows on the US southern border, and we all know how politically contentious that is. Taking a bit more of a zoom into the sort of the human terrain, the human geography, Guatemala's got a population of approximately 17.5 million people, making it the most populous Central American country. Of that population, 3 million people live in Guatemala City. Everyone loves an imaginatively named capital. In other key points, the population is very young. The median age is only 20 years old. Coming to the politics and how it matters to us, only 50% of people between 18 and 30 who are eligible to vote are actually registered to do so. This, I think, begins to give us a bit of a hint of a story of youth disenfranchisement. It also possibly gives us an indication of why migrant flows out of the country are so significant. It's generally a trend that countries with a population pyramid that's heavily skewed towards the young, those young people will seek opportunities elsewhere, and when you've got countries like the US or elsewhere in the world like Western Europe, where you've got a very different demographic shape, those youth provide a valuable influx of labour, essentially. But anyway, so that's the sort of relevance there. An additional side note I found quite interesting, 41.7% of the population, according to official stats, are indigenous Americans, and a further 43.6 are mixed European and indigenous. They call it Ladino in the stats. And this just strikes me as interesting, is often when we're looking at America, particularly when we're looking at, say, North America, there's the Native American population actually amounts to a very small percentage of the population. And it's just of interest that in Guatemala, the indigenous population amount to a significant portion of the population. I'm not sure if it's the highest in the region, but it's definitely on the podium. And that's more or less just for interest. In terms of ancient history, relatively speaking, Guatemala was torn by a bloody decades-long civil war throughout the late 20th century, coming to an end in 1996. This means that this has led to death squads, extrajudicial killings and violent crime remaining incredibly high throughout the country. And this is, again, one of the key drivers of people leaving the country. The civil war was partly kicked off by, as you'd expect in Latin America, the United States having a bit of a shit fit when a leftist government was elected after about a decade of democracy following World War II. So the Americans intervened. They put someone in who was on the right wing without necessarily any regard for his democratic sort of credentials and turned it into a bloodbath. However, while that's worth remembering, it's not particularly relevant for what we're dealing with. So now we're going to roll on to the Who and try and get some names out there. The main centerpiece of this narrative is Bernard Arevalo, top left there. He is now the President Elect of Guatemala. He, as I've said before, heads a party called Seed Movement, which grew as a mass protest movement out after large-scale anti-corruption protests in 2015, and he's been running on a broad anti-corruption ticket ever since. He's the son of a previous president, Juan Jose Arevalo, and also has held previous offices as the ambassador to Spain, and also has run a non-profit since 1999. In terms of the narrative, he was definitely the outside candidate for this election, although you'll have noticed, as I said, he's son of a former president, and there's a lot of dynastic individuals in this story. Like, a lot of the key political leaders in Guatemala come from families of previous key political leaders in Guatemala, which, if I'm honest with you, is not really the sign of a healthy democracy, but we'll see how that rolls. We've then, top right there, got Sandra Torres. She is the presidential candidate for what is now the second largest party in Congress, the UNE, which stands for the National Unity of Hope Party. The key point here, I guess, is she lost in a landslide. She got approximately 40% of the vote to Arevalo's 60%, and is continuing to refuse to admit defeat despite there not actually being any question as to Arevalo's success in the ballot box. Essentially their version of the Electoral Commission, Election Tribunal, has announced his victory, and international observers support it, but she's firmly in that position. We've then got, just by means of context, the outgoing president is Alejandro Giamatti. He's bottom right with the rather fetching sash under his blazer. So far, his actual actions have been limited to calling, overt actions, I should say, have been limited to calling for, peace and calm. That said, he is the head of government, and elements of that government are taking active steps to attempt to undermine Arevalo and Seed Movement's ascension to power. So we can probably say that actions speak louder than his lack of words there. And then completing my little square there, we've got Rafael Curruchichi. I apologise for the pronunciation. So he is the prosecutor who has led the recent legal efforts against seed movement. So it's interesting. His official office is that of he is an anti-corruption prosecutor. That's his role. He's anti-graft. Slightly ironically, though, he's been identified by numerous international organisations as a corrupt individual, and has been sanctioned by the US for taking direct steps to impede corruption investigations. So there's definitely a bit of like state capture here, where the corrupt elements in Guatemalan politics also hold the keys to power and are therefore able to sort of co-opt the law enforcement functions to enable their activities. Now, I'm not saying the US gets everything right, but if you've made yourself onto a sanctions list, there must be something pretty robust saying that you deserve it. And I mean, his actions, literally his ongoing actions against Arevalo and seed movement, simply lend weight to that allegation. So we've got a bit of a timeline here. So on the 25th of June 2023, there was the general election, and that included round one of the presidential election. So this is where we saw the 7 members of SEED get elected to Congress, the 28 members of UNE, and others. So that's the Congress sorted out. However, it led to Arevalo and Torres coming first and second place out of a number of presidential candidates. And under the Guatemalan constitution, that triggers a runoff. So immediately after that, and possibly as a bit of a shock seeing Arevalo come second, seed movement is subject to judicial action, which results in the party being suspended. And then immediately afterwards, on the 13th of July, that suspension was reversed. So no one's quite sure what's going on here. Everything's a bit manic. On the 20th of August, the runoff election happens. So this is just a 2-horse election with Torres for UNE and Arevalo for seed movement. And we don't know the results yet. This is not the United States, where we have the news going on until 5 a.m. to get results. I know the counting takes longer, but this is not a situation where you know that elections take a while to count. So on the 24th of August, a possible assassination plot against Arevalo is uncovered publicly. I've not been able to ascertain any further details about that yet, but given Guatemala's long history of, political violence, but frankly just violence, that is absolutely possible. There have been credible allegations that members of the Guatemalan military are closely tied to criminal organizations running throughout the country. So, what would you do if you were a corrupt politician with an army of hitmen at your disposal? You might be tempted to use them. This was unsuccessful. I don't think the actual attack was launched. It was definitely a discovery of a plot. And this was where we began to see international attention being paid, perhaps a little more than normal, to Guatemala, with a number of nations, like regional countries, leaning on Guatemala to use the state to protect their potential candidates. And that probably at least dissuaded them in the short term. On the 28th of August, Arevalo had his victory certified by the Guatemalan Electoral Tribunal. So that's, done, dusted, bow tied on it, all sorted. And unsurprisingly, the next day, 29th of August, SEED was suspended again. So over the weekend, ongoing legal kerfuffle. 3rd of September, Supreme Electoral Tribunal suspends the order against SEED. So this is a bit of a sort of circular terminology here, but essentially at the moment, SEED party is valid. However, the reasoning for the order being the reason for overturning the suspension was that action cannot be taken against political parties during the election period, and assumedly a bit like the US, where the constitutional setup for elections was based on a time before high-speed communication. The election period is quite long, which assumedly would have allowed her vote counting and carrying ballots around on horseback and things back in the day. So that runs until the 31st of October. That means that unless further actions happen, come 1st of November, SEED party could be resuspended again. And as I said earlier, that means that any members of SEED will not be able to take up leadership roles or sort of formal positions within the Congress. And then, again, we've got noticing the long timelines, a bit like the United States, the presidential inauguration for Arevalo, or whoever eventually is victorious in this struggle, will be on the 14th of January 2024. So that's given us our chronological placement. So we've got the how and the why now My understanding, looking into this, is that although power in Guatemala switches between a number of parties, there's a ruling clique that straddles a few of the key parties that have been referred to as a mafia-like organisation. And prior to the election, the various members of this collective had taken legal action against other parties in order to knock out key individuals in litigation. So we saw action taken against Seed Party again prior to the election. We've seen actions taken against other organisations. And this resulted in several candidates being struck off the ballot. Evidence is lacking for those allegations made against them do not appear to be valid. So at this stage, we can assume that Arevalo was not more comprehensively knocked out due to a perception that he may well have been the least threatening opposition candidate. You've got to prioritise your efforts somewhere. However, this clearly got chucked in the bin the moment he beat the sort of regime candidate, as it were, by 20%, which is, again, by Guatemalan standards, considered a landslide. And this can show a few things, but really the key emphasis is that it shows that a lot of Guatemalans are sick of corruption, and his anti-corruption message and status as an outsider was strongly appealing. There's a few possible effects that these attempts against Arevalo and C could have. Firstly, although probably unlikely at the moment, there is a prospect of them nullifying the election result. My cat has just gone past, excuse the tail. Could potentially nullify the election result. Now, I think, as I said, that's unlikely. The Electoral Tribunal has ratified the election. However, what they could do is fundamentally render Arevalo unable to rule by preventing him from appointing members of his C party into cabinet or leadership positions in the Congress, allowing the mafia, air quotes, to essentially just hem him in. So if we are assuming that their motives are primarily to prevent him conducting anti-corruption activities and to enable them to continue to enrich themselves, doing so would essentially allow them to, they wouldn't be able to perhaps escalate their corruption, but they would definitely be able to prevent him taking meaningful actions against them. And you'd probably again see continued legal action against C movement, other members of his sort of political environment, in order to undermine his ability to run a functional government. And this brings us on to other risks, the risks to an Arevalo government. And so, as we've said, including Arevalo, C movement has only 7 members in the Guatemalan Congress out of 160. Now, in a sort of proportional type electoral system, it's pretty common for the governing party not to have a majority. The idea of having governing majorities is very much a sort of Anglo-centric thing based on the first past the post used in Britain and the US. But this is a particularly small percentage of Congress to have for a ruling party. They're nowhere near the top. And that's fundamentally going to give him issues with getting things through the legislature and actually conducting government. It also, other risks posed by him coming to government stem from his limited network. Even if we ignore the sort of the mafia, again air quotes, element to Guatemalan government, fundamentally politics is the art of getting stuff done by making other people work with you, and his outsider status means that Arevalo has not got that network, and that again is likely to severely impede him. Frankly, it would impede him even if he wasn't the outsider for whom the sort of ruling elite were gunning for. So that's going to cause him some trouble. Rolling on to the conclusion. So we're likely to see further legal challenges to Arevalo and C Party's position. This could take multiple avenues. We have seen previous legal action taken against opposition or outsider parties involving corruption allegations. As we've already established, the anti-corruption prosecutors in Guatemala are, shall we say, not playing it straight. It could also see further challenges just to fundamentally undermining the legality of the party itself, and I think that is likely to continue. It's also likely, though, that any of these challenges will be met by protests in the street in support of Arevalo. We can see that there's pretty high levels of political discontent in Guatemala, and a significant portion of the population want him to be president. So any overt action taken against him is likely to be met with protests. Able to give an assessment at this stage as to what the odds of those protests turning violent are. From my reading the situation so far, the potential instigators of violence are very much on the sort of the regime side. I think on balance, it's a realistic possibility that the judicial system will enable Alevado to take office. That is not to say it will let him rule unmolested, as I've said previously, but I don't think we're looking at a situation where the Guatemalan judiciary are going to just, say no. I think the scale of his landslide and the risk of protest would probably ensure that. However, it could realistically end up with Alevado being, yes, president, but very much a lame duck one. We'll have to see how this goes. It's also likely that opposition parties will continue to aggressively oppose his rule in office, and I think that's definitely going to play out in the Congress. I think Alevado is going to struggle to get things done. I'm afraid I've not had time to fully sort of understand the balance between the executive and the legislature in Guatemala, but generally speaking, you need a bit of both, and unless he's a literal master negotiator, I think he's going to struggle to piece that together. Obviously, I wish him luck, and let's see what happens. Again, looping back up to my comments earlier about protests, I think there's a realistic possibility of increased political violence following this. Given Guatemala's high rate of violent crime, it's debatable whether you'll notice that against the backdrop of pretty horrendous situations. But yeah, it's a country with a reputation for instability, a ruling mafia clique, and a predisposition to violence. So I think we're likely to see that continuing. Otherwise, thank you very much for joining me. If you've got anything you'd like to say on the situation in Guatemala, I would love to hear from you. Please comment down below. Otherwise, please like, subscribe, or join me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or X, or whatever Twitter's called now. I'd really love to hear from you. It's a pleasure to learn from other people around the world, and I do this because I want to know what you think as well. So thank you very much, and see you soon. Bye.